Hello everyone and welcome to Quality Old Games. Today we are making another tier list, this time from Scotland's unit roster in Medieval 2 Total War. And the ratings are based on campaigns, so in addition to the unit's fighting capabilities, also the requirements and price and upkeep matter in this rating. And also the units are not rated as if they are evaluated against every other unit in Medieval 2 Total War, but rather somewhat inside Scotland's unit roster only. So, for instance, dismounted feudal knights might get a bit better or worse rating for other factions than they do for Scotland. And furthermore, my How Good Is series is kind of providing background information for this tier list. So it affects quite a lot about the ratings. But without further ado, let's begin with cavalry units. First we have bodyguard. And actually, usually I rate bodyguard as A tier because, well, the unit size is a bit smaller and you cannot train these guys. So the supply is a bit limited. On the other hand, Scotland's unit roster, especially in terms of cavalry, is not that great. So I'm kind of inclined to give the bodyguard unit in this case a weaker S tier. And of course, the good thing is that when these guys come as a bodyguard for generals, you kind of get them for free. And of course they are replenished for free, so that's really nice. Then again, if you lose the general, the bodyguard goes along with him, so yeah. But perhaps on the lower end of S tier. Then we have border horse. I mean, I was talking about weak units for Scotland's unit roster, but I mean, border horse is surprisingly good. It's tier 1 unit. It's really easy to get, and it actually punches quite a bit above its weight class. And besides, it brings other benefits of light cavalry. It's rather fast, so you can use it to intercept enemy missile units, you can chase down enemy units, but also in head-to-head combat it can do surprisingly well. So actually I think it's in top 10 or top 12 units at the moment in the How Good Is series, and that's really impressive for light cavalry in my opinion. So it most definitely deserves a place in S tier, though I'm a bit surprised myself that I'm giving it this higher place, but I mean, it has performed rather well, and it's rather cheap as well. Then we have feudal knights. I mean, basic cavalry unit available for pretty much every Christian faction, or rather Western Catholic Christian faction. It's, well, rather nice. I mean, feudal knights can serve you in the early game, mid game, and also in late game. So yeah, you should make them if you can. And kind of they are the bread and butter for every faction, so even though Scotland doesn't have any fancy cavalry units in its own roster, I mean, it doesn't suffer too much from that because, well, feudal knights are just okay. They are good enough for the heavy cavalry business they are in. And then we have Knights Hospitaller and Knights Templar, rather identical units. I mean, both are really solid units. Of course, there are some difficulties at retraining them because they require that chapter house to be able to recruit it and to be trained, and they are rather good in combat. I mean, if you can recruit them, then you should grab them. Nice enough, especially for Scotland. And then we have mailed knights, perhaps not quite as good in battle as the cavalry units mentioned before, these three, but still easier to get, and they can do decently well. So, especially if you begin with mailed knights in the early game, you can get experience for them, and with some experience and upgrades, they can be actually quite devastating in the later campaign play as well. So in my opinion, rather solid unit. Then the one cavalry unit which I don't like too much. So Merchant Cavalry Militia. And well, it has clearly some things going for it. For instance, the free upkeep in settlements for several of these units, that's really nice. But in battle, these guys do rather poorly. Of course, they are cavalry, so you can chase routing enemies, perhaps do something against archers, but if you are facing elite archers, I wouldn't bet my money on these guys winning them in melee. So, kind of unreliable unit in my opinion, but can have its uses. And then let's move to infantry. First we have dismounted feudal knights. As a rule of thumb, usually infantry fares worse than cavalry in medieval 2 Total War, and that's the case with dismounted feudal knights. I mean, they are rather okay heavy infantry. And once again, at times Scotland is accused of being rather one-sided regarding infantry, but I mean, dismounted feudal knights are rather decent infantry, in my opinion, available once again to almost every Catholic faction. And they do what heavy infantry is supposed to do without any fancies or so on and so forth. So, I mean, solid A-tier unit, perhaps a bit weaker than cavalry units, but still solid A-tier unit. Then we have heavy pike militia. This is kind of Scotland's specialty units. And of course, as it's militia unit, you can get free upkeep for it. And it can actually do really well in battles. Of course, it has a weakness against enemy missile units as it doesn't have shield. But if you stack a couple of these on top of each other and can micro them a bit in battle, they can do actually rather well. And I think I will give them a place in the lowest end of S tier, as they are actually rather solid unit. Then we have Highland Nobles. And well, they become at the same time as Highland Pikemen. I think you should stick with the Pikemen. These guys really do badly in battle, in my opinion. Especially if you compare to other heavy infantry, such as dismounted feudal knights, then obviously no go for these guys. And if you compare to pikemen, as for example those Highland pikemen, then it's once again no go, as these guys don't have shield, they are vulnerable to missiles, they are, as the animation speed of two-handed weapons seems to be a bit slower than one-handed weapons, they are suffering from that as well. So even though they are not garbage in battle, I don't think they should be made, because there are better units available. They are kind of these Highland Nobles are obsolete whenever they become available, because Scotland has better options. And one of those better options is that Highland Pikemen, which is, in my opinion, relatively solid unit, perhaps high B, low A tier. Let's put it to high B tier for the moment at the very least, so that we don't get all units put into A tier. But yeah, solid unit. Of course, the lack of armor makes it even more vulnerable to missiles, but overall I think it can do rather well in battle. Of course, mostly in defensive battles, but also in offensive it can do rather well. Of course, it can suffer against elite enemy infantry, but if you are facing light troops, they can be rather devastating against those. And then we have Highland Rabble. Yeah. I don't like peasants in medieval Total War. I don't like Highland Rabble in medieval Total War. I mean, in battle, they can hold out for a while. I'll give them that, because they have relatively high morale for peasant units, or actually high morale for peasant unit. But about their ability to deal damage, it's rather abysmal. So the only use for this unit I see is that they man towers in castles or in settlements, but otherwise just train something else if you only can. These units, I don't see the value in them. So D tier, absolutely D tier. Then we have Highlanders, and actually for their tier they are surprisingly solid unit. It most likely is that armor-piercing axe they are having as a weapon, so that's rather nice against heavier enemy troops, especially if you can get in a flank or rear attack for these guys. But their staying power leaves a bit to hope for, and because of that, in my opinion, they get placed only in B tier, because you can use cavalry, and you should use cavalry for those flanking maneuvers because of the higher speed. But then again, you don't always have cavalry available, and these guys can make decent enough front line or support the pike front line decently enough. So a B tier, and actually quite solid B tier as well. Then we have noble pikemen, which actually are pretty much on par with heavy pike militia. They fight, in my opinion, a bit better, but then again they don't get that free upkeep, and I think pretty much equal in terms of the overall rating with heavy pike militia. So these guys deserve a place here in the lower end of S tier for Scotland's roster. And then we have noble swordsmen. I mean, they do rather okay in battle, or actually they do really well in battle for heavy infantry. My only qualm is that they take highest tier barracks to train, and that's quite a lot. I mean, you can do quite a bit more with that almost 10,000 florins than just building barracks. So, and you have already access to dismounted feudal knights. So, if you, for example, capture a settlement where there are those highest tier barracks, by all means train these guys. But I question that you should build those highest tier barracks to get these guys. Perhaps the same is to some degree for these guys, though they do perform a bit better in battle. And because I will actually decrease, the requirements are a bit too high for my liking. So let's put them into somewhere here to A tier. But yeah, these guys, I think I will give them C tier nonetheless, because dismounted feudal knights are so much easier to get, and they actually perform quite well compared to these. So these noble swordsmen are actually better in battle, in my opinion, but the requirements make it quite a bit worse than dismounted feudal knights. Then we have Scots pike militia. I mean, one of the weaker pike units. I mean, they do okay. They are militia unit, so there is that free upkeep possibility. So that's nice. I mean, you could have worse units than these, but they are nothing special. So kind of the bulk of the army, perhaps until you can get better units, or perhaps you should just stick with the cavalry units or something like that. But if you need infantry, I mean, these guys are decent enough, especially for defensive purposes. Then we have spear militia. Yeah, their fighting capabilities leave quite a lot to hope for. Of course, they can do relatively well against cavalry units, and they can really buy time for your other units to maneuver, or even your missile units to get in some damage. So that's their use. They are kind of a meat shield that can sting at some times, but not really that good in my opinion. So I will give them C tier over here. And then we have Town Militia, kind of a worse version from the Spear Militia. Of course, for both of these units, the free upkeep is a nice bonus. And that's the one thing that keeps these guys from dropping into D tier. Because in battle, well, they can buy a bit of time, but they are not really that efficient. And overall, I think you should kind of be able to, or seek to upgrade the units as soon as possible. So, or rather phase out these units as soon as possible, because there are better militia unit options available. Then again, there might be situations where you just need some units and there are no better units available, so I guess C tier on the lower end. Then let's move to missile units. First we have Highland Archers. I mean, missile units tend to be okay. Then again, the Highland Archers leave a bit to hope for. Of course, they do carry axes, which is rather nice in melee, but their weak armor makes them rather vulnerable to enemy cavalry charges, or if enemy infantry can engage them in melee. So, yeah, I think a B tier only for these guys. Then we have Noble Highland Archers, kind of an improvement over Highland Archers, but still not quite as good as other factions' elite archers. So these guys have a bit better protection, and of course they are more difficult to get and they deal a bit more damage, but they don't particularly shine in combat. So in my opinion, the most glaring weakness is their lack of armor-piercing missiles, which kind of the crossbowmen do have. So even if they have a bit higher rate of fire than crossbowmen, I still think they perform quite a bit worse than crossbowmen. And even though they deserve a place in the highest B tier, I think they don't quite have it what it takes to go to A tier. Perhaps these guys eventually do, so let's put them in front of those Noble Highland Archers. And the last archery unit, Peasant Archers. I mean, you cannot expect much from these guys, but they actually deliver quite nicely, especially if you can shoot the enemy in the rear or flank. So easy to access, and they can do surprisingly lot. So because of that, I think I will give them a solid B tier rank. So I think this kind of reveals, in my opinion, the major weakness for Scotland, which is the lack of proper missile units. So if their best missile unit is in B tier, then they need to kind of somehow overcome the fact that other factions have access to crossbows and other factions have access to firearms, which can actually be rather important, especially in later game. Then let's move to siege weapons. First we have Ballista, and overall I have to admit that I don't like siege weapons that much. In my opinion, they don't do enough damage and they slow down the armies. Of course, knocking down castle walls can be rather important in some cases if you need to take the settlement quickly. And furthermore, if you have good defensive army, you can kind of force the enemy into battle or attacking you if you have siege weapon superiority. So in some cases they might be useful, but in any case, in my opinion, Ballista is rather useless. Because the slow rate of fire, and second, the one missile doesn't do that much damage, and they are practically useless against castle walls. So C tier, and I'm kind of tempted to give them D, but let's put it C in for the sake of consistency for other tier lists. Then we have Bombard, the first gunpowder siege unit. And, well, it can do rather okay. It's rather efficient at knocking down those walls, not so, in my opinion, against other units, but, well, with a lucky shot, they can do something there as well. But overall, I think their main purpose is to knock down the walls, and for that, they are decent enough. And then we have my kind of exception siege unit catapult, and the reason is that they, in my opinion, do actually relatively well against enemy units because of the flying trajectory of the ammo they fire. So it can do, especially the flaming ammo, can do relatively nice damage, especially against clumped up enemies. And actually I think catapults can be relatively accurate, if that's at all possible for siege weapons. But you can actually land some decent shots with these guys, and also they do have some punching power against walls, so they are not completely useless in sieges. And that's the reason, or those are the reasons I give them place in the lowest end of A tier. Then we have Cavalry, rather higher tech artillery unit. They are rather good for knocking down walls, they inflict quite a bit of damage. Then again, the requirements are quite a bit higher than for bombards, so that's the reason they get a bit lower place in B tier, in my opinion. Then we have mortar. I mean, the possibility that you can fire over walls in kind of parabolic angles can have its uses, especially if you manage to land a hit on the top of the wall when it's being manned with some elite unit. So mortars can actually do something, but for knocking down walls, I don't think they are that good. Are they good enough to replace, for instance, one cavalry or heavy infantry unit? I don't think so. Perhaps they could replace one of the missile units. So, I don't know. I haven't used that much of mortars, so if I'm rating these completely wrong, feel free to address that in the comments below. Let's put them into the lower end of B tier. Then we have Revolt. Yeah, another B tier unit. It's really nice when they get to fire, especially if you don't have friendly units in front of them. They can do rather heavy damage and they can rout enemy units rather quickly. So that can be rather nice. So I guess B tier for them. And then we have trebuchets. They are the best early game option for knocking down walls. Then again, I don't know, they are not that good for anything else. So I'm kind of inclined to give them place only in C tier, perhaps in low B. C, let's put them into C. And as we didn't put all units into A tier, let's move these. I guess these were Highland pikemen. Let's move them into A tier. So, this is my view of Scotland's unit roster in Medieval 2 Total War in the campaign setting. Do you agree or disagree? Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below. And also, if you liked the video, please leave a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. And a huge thanks for channel member. Your support is greatly treasured, and everyone else, if you want to support the channel or become channel member and gain access to the perks, some emojis, higher priority for your wishes for future battles, then go to check that membership page. Have a great rest of the day. Quality Old Games out.